Hey guys, tonight we begin with something ancient Rome quietly excelled at. Conspiracies. Not the modern kind with blurry theories and comment sections, the real kind. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 44 before Christ, Julius Caesar was assassinated, and what makes this one of the most unsettling conspiracies in Roman history is not how secret it was, but how incredibly obvious it was. By this point, Caesar had accumulated an amount of power that made the Roman Republic look less like a republic, and more like a suggestion. Dictator for life, honours piling up, statues, titles, subtle hints that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't planning to give that power back. And the Roman elite did not love that, because Romans had a long-standing cultural allergy to kings. So naturally, instead of sending a strongly worded letter, they started planning his assassination. Whispers spread through the Senate. Quiet meetings. Side glances. The kind of atmosphere where everyone feels something is off, but continues attending meetings anyway, which is very Roman behaviour. Except here's the part that makes it almost ridiculous. Caesar was warned. Multiple times. A soothsayer told him to beware the Ides of March, which is not vague. That is basically ancient Rome's version of a flashing red warning sign. Then there was the note. According to sources, someone tried to hand Caesar a written warning on the day itself, a document that allegedly contained details of the entire plot. He didn't read it, which suggests that even in ancient Rome, important documents were occasionally ignored at the worst possible moment. Then there was his wife, Calpurnia. She had nightmares about his death and begged him not to go to the Senate. At this point, Caesar had a prophecy, a written warning, a concerned spouse, and still thought, yes, I will attend this meeting. Confidence is admirable. This might have been something else. And then there's the conspirators themselves. These were not mysterious figures hiding in shadows. They were senators, colleagues, people Caesar saw regularly, men like Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Not exactly subtle. This wasn't a hidden conspiracy. It was more like a poorly kept group project that everyone knew about, but no one wanted to interrupt. So on the Ides of March, Caesar walked into the Senate. No guards, no real concern. Just the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable, and within moments the rumours stopped being rumours. The whispers became knives, and the conspiracy that had been discussed, hinted at, and practically announced, finally happened. Because in ancient Rome, the most dangerous plots weren't always the secret ones. They were the ones everyone knew about, and somehow still went ahead anyway. After Caesar's assassination, Rome entered a phase historians politely call instability, which is a very calm way of describing civil wars, shifting alliances, and a general atmosphere of, let's see who survives this. Out of that chaos emerged Augustus. And if you asked Augustus what he was doing, he would tell you something very reassuring. He was restoring the Republic, giving power back to the Senate, stabilizing Rome, definitely not becoming a king, which, to be fair, is exactly what someone becoming a king would say. Augustus was a master of presentation. Unlike Caesar, who had collected power openly and made people nervous, Augustus moved slowly, carefully, almost politely. He accepted titles one at a time. He refused power until it became necessary. He positioned himself as the protector of the Republic, while quietly making sure that nothing important happened without him. It was subtle. Very subtle. So subtle that many people at the time convinced themselves that nothing unusual was happening, except for the small detail that Augustus controlled the army, the treasury, and most political decisions. But other than that, completely normal. There were rumours, of course, that this whole Restoring the Republic Act was exactly that. An act that Augustus had no intention of stepping aside, that he was building something new, a monarchy, just with better branding. At the time, these suspicions sounded a bit cynical, because Augustus was careful. He respected traditions. He avoided the title of king. He kept the Senate functioning. He made everything look familiar. And that was the genius of it. Because people don't panic when things look familiar, even if everything underneath has changed. Over time, however, the reality became impossible to ignore. Augustus wasn't temporarily holding power. He was the system. The Republic still existed, technically, but real authority had shifted, permanently. And those early conspiracy theories that he was quietly transforming Rome into an empire, they turned out to be completely accurate. Augustus didn't destroy the Republic dramatically. He replaced it slowly, which is far more effective and much harder to stop. Because by the time people realize what's happening, it's already done. If you were living in Rome during the reign of Augustus, you might have noticed something interesting. People around him had a habit of dying, not dramatically, not loudly, just conveniently. And standing very calmly in the background of all this was Livia Drusilla. Now officially, Livia was everything a Roman elite woman was supposed to be. Dignified, intelligent, loyal, supportive, always present, always composed, always exactly where power was. Unofficially, there were rumours. Lots of them. Because Augustus had a succession problem. He needed a clear heir to stabilise his carefully constructed system. But several of his chosen successors, young, promising men, kept dying before they could actually succeed him. One after another. Which, statistically, starts to feel less like bad luck, and more like a pattern. Names like Gaius and Lucius Caesar, potential heirs, died unexpectedly. Others were removed from the line of succession under circumstances that made people curious. And who benefited from all of this? Eventually, it was Tiberius, Livia's son, which is where the rumours become very specific. People began whispering that Livia was not just observing events, she was influencing them, possibly arranging them, possibly accelerating them. Poison was the favourite explanation, because in Rome, poison was the quietest solution to a political problem. No public confrontation, no obvious conflict, just a sudden illness and a funeral. At the time, these accusations were hard to prove, which is exactly what made them so effective as rumours. Was Livia actually responsible? We don't have definitive proof, but modern historians tend to agree on one thing. The suspicions were not unreasonable, because the pattern is difficult to ignore. Potential heirs disappear. Her son rises. Power consolidates. And through all of it, Livia remains calm, respected, and very close to the centre of authority, which makes her one of the most fascinating figures in Roman history, because she represents a type of power that is easy to overlook, quiet, patient, indirect, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. And in a world full of very loud conspiracies, sometimes the most effective ones are the ones that barely make a sound. When Tiberius became emperor, people in Rome had a theory. He was paranoid, suspicious of everyone, constantly worried about plots, ordering trials, executions, and investigations that seemed excessive, even by Roman standards. From the outside, it looked like classic imperial overreaction, the kind of ruler who sees danger everywhere, even when it isn't there. Except in Rome, that assumption comes with a problem, because very often the danger was there. Tiberius inherited an empire that had just survived civil wars, power struggles, and a carefully managed transition from republic to monarchy that nobody officially called a monarchy, which means trust was already in short supply. And on top of that, the Roman political system encouraged competition. Ambition wasn't hidden, it was expected. Senators wanted influence, generals wanted power, advisors wanted proximity to the emperor. And when you combine ambition with opportunity, you get conspiracies, real ones. So when Tiberius started acting cautiously, watching people closely, reacting quickly to threats, allowing treason trials to expand, many assumed he had gone too far, that he was imagining enemies, that he was ruling through fear. But here's where things become uncomfortable. Some of those threats were real. Plots did exist. Rivalries did turn into schemes. People did look at the emperor and think, I could do better. Which means Tiberius wasn't operating in a safe environment. He was operating in a very dangerous one. And instead of trusting people, he stopped. Completely. Over time, Tiberius withdrew from Rome entirely and ruled from the island of Capri. From there, he governed at a distance, relying on reports, advisors, and a system that increasingly revolved around suspicion, which only made things worse, because the more he withdrew, the more rumours spread, and the more rumours spread, the more suspicious he became. A perfect cycle. But here's the key detail. The conspiracy theory that Tiberius was surrounded by plots and threats, that people were actively trying to undermine him, that he couldn't trust the system he ruled. It wasn't entirely wrong. In fact, it might have been one of the most accurate assessments of Roman politics at the time. Because in a world where power constantly shifts and loyalty is negotiable, paranoia stops being irrational and starts being preparation. While Tiberius slowly withdrew from public life and relocated to Capri, Rome didn't exactly pause. Power doesn't like empty space. It fills it. And in this case, it was filled by a man named Sejanus. Officially, Sejanus was the commander of the Praetorian Guard, the elite unit responsible for protecting the emperor. Unofficially, he was becoming something much more interesting. As Tiberius distanced himself from daily politics, Sejanus remained in Rome, handling communication, managing access to the emperor, and influencing decisions, which sounds administrative. Until you realize what that actually means. If you control who speaks to the emperor, you control what the emperor hears. And if you control what the emperor hears, you start shaping reality. Sejanus understood this very well. He consolidated power quietly. He reorganized the Praetorian Guard, bringing them together into a single camp just outside Rome, which made them more efficient and more loyal to him. He removed rivals through accusations of treason. He influenced trials. He positioned himself as indispensable. From the outside, it looked like he was simply helping manage the empire. From the inside, it looked like he was building his own. Rumours began to spread. That Sejanus wasn't just loyal, he was ambitious. That he wasn't just serving the emperor, he was preparing to replace him. At the time, these rumours sounded like the usual Roman paranoia. Another powerful figure being accused of wanting more than he officially claimed. But here's the uncomfortable part. Those suspicions were not wrong. Sejanus had begun manoeuvring himself closer to the imperial family. He pursued alliances. He positioned himself as the natural centre of power in Rome, while Tiberius remained distant. Step by step, he moved from advisor to gatekeeper to potential successor. The problem with subtle power is that it works until someone notices, and eventually Tiberius did. From Capri, the emperor began receiving reports, quiet warnings, indications that Sejanus might not be as loyal as he appeared, which led to one of the most dramatic reversals in Roman history. Because in Rome you can rise quietly, but when you fall, it is usually very loud. When people think of Nero, they usually imagine chaos, fires, executions, music, questionable decisions. And for a long time, historians debated whether his reputation was exaggerated. Was Nero really that bad? Or was he just the victim of hostile sources and political propaganda? Because Roman writers had a tendency to dramatize. But here's the uncomfortable answer. some of those wild rumours about Nero, they were probably true. Even during his reign, people whispered that Nero was involved in a series of very convenient deaths. Rivals, advisors, family members, people who, quite frankly, had a habit of becoming obstacles. The most famous example, his mother, Agrippina the Younger. Now, Roman politics between family members was already complicated, but even by those standards, this situation escalated quickly. At first, Nero tried to distance himself from her influence. Then, according to ancient accounts, he tried to have her killed, more than once. One of the attempts allegedly involved a specially designed collapsing boat, which is already a very creative solution to a family disagreement. Unfortunately for Nero, the boat plan failed. Agrippina survived, which made things awkward. So Nero chose a more direct approach. He had her assassinated. And while ancient sources sometimes exaggerate details, modern historians generally agree on one thing. This part is very likely true, which tells you a lot about the environment Nero was operating in, but it doesn't stop there. Rumours also surrounded the deaths of other figures close to him, including his wife Octavia and various political opponents. At the time, some people dismissed these stories as gossip, because they sounded extreme. But as more evidence and analysis emerged, the pattern became clearer. Nero wasn't just reacting to threats, he was removing them, proactively, which is a much more controlled form of chaos. So the conspiracy theory that Nero was secretly orchestrating deaths around him, it wasn't entirely a theory, it was closer to a strategy. Because in ancient Rome, power was rarely maintained through trust, it was maintained through control. And sometimes, that control was very final. In the year 64 after Christ, Rome burned. Not metaphorically, very literally. A massive fire broke out in the city and spread rapidly through its crowded streets. Wooden buildings, narrow alleys, and closely packed neighbourhoods turned Rome into something dangerously flammable. Within days, large parts of the city were destroyed. Homes, temples, shops, gone. And as the flames died down, the rumours began. Because in Rome, disasters were rarely seen as accidents. They were opportunities, and people quickly started asking a very uncomfortable question. Did Nero start the fire? Now, at the time, this sounded like a wild accusation. The emperor burning his own capital? That seems counterproductive. But then people started noticing a few details. First, Nero benefited from the fire, a lot. The destruction allowed for large-scale rebuilding. Streets could be redesigned, areas could be cleared, and most importantly, Nero began constructing his enormous palace complex, the Domus Aurea, right in the newly available space, which is a very convenient outcome. Second, his behaviour raised eyebrows. Ancient sources claim he performed during the fire, possibly singing, possibly not. The details are debated, but the image stuck. An emperor watching his city burn, while enjoying the moment. Not a great look. Third, and perhaps most telling, Nero needed someone to blame, so he blamed the Christians, a small and already unpopular group at the time. They were accused of starting the fire and punished severely, which, from a political perspective, was effective, but also suspicious, because when someone quickly assigns blame, it often raises the question, why so fast? Now, to be fair, modern historians do not have definitive proof that Nero ordered the fire. Rome was highly flammable. Fires were common. This one may have simply gotten out of control. But here's the key detail. The suspicion never disappeared. Even in ancient times, people believed something was off, that the fire had been too convenient, too beneficial, too perfectly aligned with what Nero wanted to build next. And while we may never have absolute certainty, the conspiracy theory that Nero had a hand in it, it has remained plausible for over 2,000 years, which is impressive, and slightly concerning, because sometimes in history, the line between accident and opportunity gets very blurry. If you lived in ancient Rome and someone important died suddenly, there was a standard reaction. Poison. not investigation, not confusion. Just poison. Because poisoning wasn't rare. It was normal. Romans were absolutely convinced that elites were quietly eliminating each other with toxins, and for a long time historians thought this might be exaggerated, dramatic, overstated, the kind of thing people say when they don't understand why someone died. But here's the problem. The Romans were probably right. Poisoning in the Roman world was disturbingly common, especially among the upper classes. It was discreet, effective, and, most importantly, deniable. No public fight. No visible violence. Just a sudden illness, followed by a funeral and a lot of very careful silence, which made it perfect for political situations. Unwanted heir, rival gaining influence, relative becoming inconvenient. There was a solution. And it didn't require an army. One of the most infamous figures associated with this was Locusta. Yes, Rome had professional poisoners, which already tells you everything you need to know about how often this method was used. Locusta was employed by powerful figures, including, reportedly, Nero, to create poisons tailored to specific situations. Fast-acting, slow-acting, subtle, very subtle. The kind of customization you don't want in a society. There are strong indications that poison was used in several high-profile deaths, including that of Emperor Claudius. Ancient sources suggest mushrooms were involved, which means even dinner could be dangerous. And suddenly, those Roman dinner invitations feel a lot more stressful. At the time, accusations of poisoning were often dismissed as rumours, because they sounded dramatic, convenient, too easy. But as more evidence has been studied and patterns examined, historians have increasingly accepted that poisoning was not just occasional, it was part of the system. A quiet, efficient way to solve problems that would otherwise require open conflict. Which means the conspiracy theory that powerful Romans were constantly poisoning each other was not paranoia. It was basic awareness. Because in a world where power is everything, and trust is limited, sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not a sword, it's dinner. By the time Commodus came to power, Rome had already developed a strong tradition of political suspicion. People assumed plots existed, because they usually did, and Commodus did absolutely nothing to calm those fears. In fact, he made them worse. Much worse. Commodus ruled like a man who had discovered absolute power, and immediately decided to use it in the most unpredictable ways possible. He styled himself as a living god. He renamed Rome. He participated in gladiator fights, not as a spectator, but as a performer, which, for an emperor, was about as appropriate as a CEO deciding to personally run customer complaints in a boxing ring. It made him popular with some. It made the elite deeply uncomfortable. And when the elite in Rome become uncomfortable, they don't just complain. They start talking. Quietly, then less quietly. Rumours began to spread that Commodus was unstable, dangerous, a threat not just to individuals, but to the entire system. At the time, these rumours might have sounded exaggerated, because surely the emperor wouldn't be that reckless. Surely there were limits. There were not. Commodus increasingly sidelined the Senate, relied on favourites, and made decisions that seemed driven more by personal impulse than long-term strategy, which is not ideal when you are running an empire. So naturally, people started thinking about solutions, permanent ones. And this time, the conspiracy wasn't hidden. It was expected, even anticipated. Eventually, a group formed that included members of his inner circle, people close enough to know his routines, his habits, and his vulnerabilities. Because if you're going to remove an emperor, it helps to know when he's alone. The plan was simple: poison first. Then, when that didn't work quickly enough, more direct action. Commodus was strangled in his bath, which is not a dignified ending, but then again, Roman politics rarely offered those. And here's the key detail. Nobody was surprised. The rumours had been there. The suspicions had been growing. The idea that Commodus would eventually be removed wasn't shocking. It was inevitable. which makes this one of the clearest examples in Roman history where the conspiracy theory wasn't speculation. It was a countdown, and everyone knew how it would end. They just didn't know exactly when, until it happened. By this point, Roman politics had already developed a reputation: unstable, competitive, occasionally fatal. But what happened after the death of Commodus pushed things into a completely different category. Because the next conspiracy theory wasn't about whispers or suspicion. It was about something so absurd that people at the time could barely believe it. The Roman Empire was for sale, and not metaphorically, literally. After Commodus was assassinated, a man named Pertinax briefly became emperor. He attempted to restore discipline, reform the system, and generally act like a responsible ruler, which lasted about 3 months. Because the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for protecting the emperor, had different priorities, they killed him. And then, instead of carefully selecting a new ruler, they held an auction. Yes, an auction. The most powerful position in the known world was offered to whoever could pay the most money. 2 main bidders emerged, including Didius Julianus, who promised the Praetorian Guard a massive payment. He won, because apparently that's how imperial succession worked that day. Now imagine being a Roman citizen hearing this news. The empire, your empire, had just been sold like property. At the time, people didn't quite process it as reality. It sounded like a rumor, a joke, an exaggeration. Surely this couldn't be how power actually changed hands. Except it was. Didius Julianus was declared emperor, officially, legally, technically, but not convincingly. Because buying power and holding power are 2 very different things. The rest of the empire, especially the legions, were not particularly impressed with this transaction. Several military leaders immediately rejected his rule. And just like that, the empire plunged into another round of civil war, which tends to happen when leadership is determined by bidding. The key point here is simple. The idea that Rome had become so corrupt, so unstable, that even the throne could be bought, was not a conspiracy theory. It was an event. It actually happened. And it showed something very clearly. By this stage, the Roman system wasn't just vulnerable to conspiracies. It had become one. And once that happens, things rarely improve quietly. By the time Caracalla came to power, Rome had already seen its fair share of conspiracies, assassinations, and unexpected deaths. So when rumours started circulating about tension between him and his brother, people paid attention. Because in Rome, family disagreements had a habit of becoming permanent. Caracalla and his younger brother Geta were supposed to rule together, which, in theory, sounds like a balanced arrangement. Shared power, mutual respect, cooperation. In reality, it was the political equivalent of locking 2 rivals in the same room and asking them to share everything. Sources from the time describe the 2 as deeply incompatible. They argued, avoided each other, and reportedly even considered dividing the empire just to avoid further interaction, which is not a great sign for co-rulers. The court quickly split into factions. Some supported Caracalla, others supported Geta. Tension grew. Rumours spread. Whispers that one of them would eventually try to remove the other. At the time, these whispers might have sounded dramatic. After all, they were brothers, sons of the previous emperor. Surely there were limits. There were not. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a reconciliation meeting, a peaceful discussion, a chance to resolve their differences, which, in Roman political terms, is often when things go very wrong. Geta arrived with minimal protection, likely expecting at least the appearance of safety. Instead, Caracalla had arranged for soldiers to be present. The meeting did not last long. Geta was attacked and killed, in front of their mother, which adds a level of discomfort that Roman history somehow manages to normalize. Afterward, Caracalla didn't just remove his brother, he attempted to erase him. Geta's name was struck from records, his images destroyed, his memory officially condemned, which is the ancient Roman version of deleting someone permanently. But here's the important detail. The rumours had been there all along. People suspected the tension would end in violence. They expected betrayal, and they were right. This wasn't a shocking twist. It was the outcome everyone quietly predicted. Because in a system where power cannot be shared, eventually someone stops pretending. And in Rome, that moment was rarely subtle. By the time Elagabalus took power, Rome had already seen its fair share of unusual rulers. But even by Roman standards, he stood out. From the very beginning, rumours surrounded him. Wild ones, stories of strange rituals, shocking behaviour, complete disregard for tradition, and a level of unpredictability that made even experienced Roman elites uncomfortable. At first, many assumed these stories were exaggerated, because Roman historians had a habit of turning disliked emperors into dramatic cautionary tales. Surely it couldn't all be true. Surely some of it was embellished. It was. Just not as much as people hoped. Elagabalus came from the eastern provinces and was deeply devoted to a sun god known as Elagabal. When he became emperor, he didn't quietly adapt to Roman traditions. He tried to replace them. He elevated his god above Jupiter, Rome's chief deity, and attempted to centre Roman religion around it, which in a city built on tradition was not a popular move. At all. But it didn't stop there. Ancient sources describe behaviour that seemed designed to provoke confusion and outrage. Lavish banquets, unusual ceremonies, unexpected decisions that ignored established norms. At the time, many Romans believed these stories were either exaggerated or politically motivated, because it's easier to assume exaggeration than to accept that your emperor is genuinely unpredictable. But modern historians, while cautious, generally agree on one point. Elagabalus was indeed unconventional. Perhaps not every story is accurate, but enough of them align to suggest that the overall picture is not entirely fictional, which means the conspiracy theory that Rome was being ruled by someone completely detached from its traditions and expectations was not really a theory. It was a situation. And like most situations in Roman politics, it did not resolve peacefully. Eventually, members of the Praetorian Guard, the same group that had already demonstrated flexible loyalty, turned against him. Elagabalus was assassinated, his body reportedly discarded, his memory condemned, which by now was becoming a pattern, because Rome could tolerate many things: corruption, violence, conspiracies, but unpredictability, that made people nervous. And when people in Rome became nervous, history tended to repeat itself. If you asked a Roman citizen whether the Senate was involved in conspiracies, the answer would likely be very simple. Yes. Not always loudly, not always successfully, but consistently. Because the Roman Senate was not just a governing body. It was a collection of powerful, ambitious individuals, all trying to maintain influence in a system that constantly shifted. And when influence is at stake, cooperation tends to become temporary, very temporary. Throughout Roman history, emperors often suspected the Senate of plotting against them, and for a long time, historians debated whether those suspicions were exaggerated. Were emperors just paranoid, seeing threats where none existed? Or was something else going on? The uncomfortable answer is both. Because while some emperors absolutely overreacted, the Senate did in fact engage in conspiracies. Regularly. Against emperors. Against rivals. Against anyone who became too powerful, too unpredictable, or too dangerous to ignore. The Senate had a long tradition of defending the idea of the Republic, even after the Republic had effectively ended, which meant many senators quietly resented imperial authority. They couldn't openly oppose it. That would be unhealthy. But they could influence it, undermine it, and occasionally attempt to remove it. Some conspiracies were successful, others failed. Many were discovered before they could fully develop, but the pattern remained. plotting was not unusual. It was expected, and this created a strange dynamic. Emperors didn't trust the Senate didn't trust the emperor, and both sides were often correct, which meant Roman politics operated in a constant state of tension. Not open war, but not peace either. Something in between, a quiet competition for control, where conversations mattered, alliances mattered, and sometimes so did timing. Because if you moved too early, you failed. If you moved too late, you were removed. And if you did nothing, someone else would. So the conspiracy theory that the Senate was always plotting, it wasn't paranoia. It was a job description. Because in Rome, power didn't sit still, and neither did the people trying to control it. By this point, a pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Assassinations, poisonings, power grabs, unexpected deaths that everyone quietly expected. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, one realization starts to form. Conspiracies in Rome weren't rare. They were structural. From the final years of the Republic to the height of the Empire, power in Rome was never truly stable. It didn't sit neatly in one place. It moved, shifted, adapted, depending on who was strong, who was connected, and who was still alive, which, as we've seen, was not always guaranteed. Take Julius Caesar. His assassination wasn't a sudden shock. It was the result of growing tension, visible ambition, and a group of people deciding that removing him was the only solution. Then take Augustus. He didn't seize power dramatically. He restructured the system quietly, turning a republic into an empire while keeping the appearance of tradition. No loud betrayal, just a slow replacement. And then there's everything that followed. Rulers eliminating rivals, advisors rising too high, family members turning into threats, all of it happening beneath a surface that tried to look stable, because Rome valued appearance, order, control. But underneath that surface, things were always moving, always shifting, always slightly unstable, and that instability created a very specific kind of environment, one where loyalty was temporary, trust was conditional, and betrayal was not shocking. It was expected. In fact, if something looked too stable in Rome, that was usually the moment to become suspicious, because stability often meant someone had not acted yet, and someone always acted eventually. Which is why so many conspiracy theories from ancient Rome turned out to be true. They weren't wild ideas, they were observations, people noticing patterns, recognizing behavior, understanding how power actually worked. Because in Rome, the real story was rarely written in official speeches. It was written in what happened quietly, behind closed doors, between allies who weren't always allies. And once you start seeing that pattern, Roman history stops looking like a series of isolated events and starts looking like one continuous negotiation with very high stakes and very sharp consequences. By now, one thing should feel very clear. In ancient Rome, suspicion wasn't irrational. It was practical. If you lived in a system where emperors were assassinated, heirs died unexpectedly, advisors quietly accumulated power, and entire governments could be influenced behind closed doors, you didn't need imagination. You needed awareness. Because the line between rumour and reality was very thin. Take any moment we've looked at. The warnings before Julius Caesar was killed, the slow rise of Augustus, the quiet influence of Livia Drusilla, the growing power of Sejanus, the actions of Nero. At the time, these were surrounded by whispers, suspicions, theories, people connecting dots that didn't quite form a complete picture, yet. And in many cases, those dots eventually connected, not because people were guessing wildly, but because they understood the system they were living in. A system where power was unstable, where loyalty shifted, where survival often depended on acting before someone else did. So when something felt off, it usually was. Which creates a strange kind of environment, one where trusting too much is dangerous, but distrusting everything is exhausting. And most people lived somewhere in between, watching, listening, trying to figure out which rumours were just rumours, and which ones were warnings. Because sometimes a conspiracy theory is just a story, but sometimes it's the early version of history, and ancient Rome gives us a perfect example of that. A world where the most unbelievable ideas were often the most accurate, which, in its own way, makes Roman history feel less like the past, and more like a very long lesson in how power actually works. In Tudor England, the boundary between the living and the dead was not a sealed door. It was more like a thin, drafty curtain that never quite stayed still. People did not simply believe in ghosts. They lived with the quiet assumption that the dead were still nearby, watching, listening, and occasionally making their presence known in the most inconvenient ways possible. A sudden chill in a warm room was not dismissed. A shadow that lingered too long was not ignored. These were signs, and ignoring signs, in Tudor logic, was a terrible idea. This mindset did not come from imagination alone. It was deeply rooted in religion, which, during the Tudor period, was going through what could generously be described as an identity crisis. Under Henry VIII, England broke away from the Catholic Church, and with that came a dramatic shift in how people understood the afterlife. The idea of purgatory, a sort of waiting room for souls, was swept aside by Protestant reformers. According to this new view, souls did not linger. They went straight to heaven or hell. And yet, people still felt them. This contradiction created a strange tension. Officially, ghosts were not supposed to exist anymore. Unofficially, everyone still heard footsteps in empty halls. Servants whispered about figures seen at the foot of beds. Travellers avoided certain roads at night, not because they were unsafe, but because something unseen walked them long after sunset. So explanations had to evolve. If a spirit appeared, it could not be a wandering soul from purgatory anymore. That would contradict the new religious order. Instead, it was often labelled something far more unsettling, a demon in disguise, something pretending to be the dead, sent to mislead the living. Which, if anything, made the situation worse, because now every unexplained sound was not just a ghost. It might be something far darker, something actively trying to deceive you. Sleep became uneasy, nighttime became suspicious, and the ordinary world, once filled with predictable routines, now felt layered with invisible dangers. In Tudor England, fear was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet. It crept into daily life, sat beside you in candlelight, and followed you down long corridors when no one else was there. And once you accepted that the dead might still be watching, it became very difficult to ever feel truly alone again. If you lived in Tudor England, death rarely arrived without warning, or at least that's what people believed. The world was filled with signs, subtle, unsettling clues that something was about to go terribly wrong, and once you started noticing them, it became impossible to stop. One of the most feared omens was the sudden appearance of animals behaving incorrectly. A dog howling at nothing in the night was not just a noisy inconvenience. It was said to be sensing spirits nearby, often a sign that someone in the household would soon die. Cats, too, were treated with suspicion, especially if they stared too long into empty corners, which, unfortunately, cats tend to do anyway. Birds were perhaps even worse. A lone raven circling above a house could send an entire family into quiet panic. Owls hooting near a window at night were not charming woodland creatures. They were messengers of death, announcing that someone inside might not see another sunrise, and if a bird flew directly into a window, that was considered less of an accident and more of a very blunt warning. But animals were only part of it. The human body itself could betray signs. A ringing in the ears, a sudden shiver, or an unexplained feeling of dread, all were taken seriously. Even something as small as a candle extinguishing itself without reason could turn a calm evening into a tense silence. Because if the light could disappear that easily, what else might follow? Then there were dreams. Dreams were not just dreams, they were messages. Seeing a recently deceased person in your sleep was often interpreted as a visitation. and rarely a friendly one. If they spoke, people listened carefully, sometimes waking with a sense of urgency they couldn't fully explain. Mirrors, too, carried their own dangers. If someone died in a house, it was common to cover mirrors immediately. The fear was that a wandering soul might become trapped inside the glass, lingering indefinitely. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How many mirrors were already occupied? Of course, not every omen led to death. But that uncertainty was exactly what made them so powerful. You could never be sure which sign was harmless, and which one was quietly announcing the end of someone's story. So people watched. They listened. They interpreted everything. Because in a world where death left clues behind, ignoring them felt far more dangerous than believing in them. If omens whispered that death was near, castles were where those warnings seemed to settle and stay. Tudor England was filled with grand stone residences, impressive, cold, and according to many, already occupied by more than just the living. These were not simply homes of power and status. They were places where the past refused to remain in the past. Castles, by their very nature, were ideal settings for ghost stories. Thick walls trapped sound in strange ways. Long corridors stretched into darkness. Staircases turned sharply, often hiding more than they revealed. And at night, when candles burned low and servants moved quietly through shadowed halls, every small noise seemed to carry meaning. But the real reason castles were considered haunted was far less architectural and far more human. These were places of ambition, betrayal, and often violence. Political plots unfolded behind closed doors. Prisoners were held, interrogated, and sometimes executed within the very walls that later housed royal banquets. And when death came suddenly, especially unjustly, it was believed the soul did not move on easily. One of the most enduring types of ghost was the restless spirit. Unlike a peaceful soul, which might quietly depart, a restless spirit lingered because something was unresolved. A betrayal unpunished, a secret unrevealed. Or, in some cases, a rather inconvenient murder that no one wanted to acknowledge publicly. Servants were often the first to report these encounters. They spoke of footsteps echoing through empty corridors long after everyone had retired. Doors opening slowly, without any visible hand. Cold drafts that seemed to follow a person from room to room, as if something unseen had taken an interest in them. And then there were the sightings. Figures dressed in outdated clothing, sometimes armour, sometimes courtly garments, appearing briefly at the end of a hallway before vanishing entirely. Faces pale, expressions unreadable, as if caught between remembering and forgetting why they remained. Of course, not everyone admitted to believing these stories. Nobles in particular preferred to maintain a sense of control and rationality. After all, it is difficult to project authority when your castle might be hosting uninvited guests from the afterlife. But even they were not immune to unease, because in a place filled with history, where every stone had witnessed something, a whispered conspiracy, a desperate plea, a final breath, the idea that some part of it might linger did not feel entirely unreasonable, and so the candles stayed lit a little longer. The doors were closed a little more carefully, and no one, no matter their rank, walked those corridors at night without listening just a bit more closely than they cared to admit. If ghosts represented the restless past, then curses and witchcraft embodied something far more immediate, a threat that could reach into your life at any moment, quietly and without warning. In Tudor England, misfortune was rarely seen as random. Illness, failed crops, sudden deaths. These were not just unfortunate events. They were often interpreted as the result of someone somewhere doing something unnatural. And that someone was usually a witch. The idea of witchcraft was not fringe or rare. It was woven into everyday thinking. A neighbour who argued too often, an old woman who lived alone, someone who knew a bit too much about herbs and remedies, all could quickly fall under suspicion. It did not take much. A single disagreement, followed by a streak of bad luck, could be enough to convince an entire village that something darker was at work. Curses, in particular, were deeply feared. A spoken word, a muttered phrase, even a glance held for too long, these could all be interpreted as acts of harm. People believed that witches could cause milk to sour, animals to fall ill, or children to become sick without any visible cause. And because these effects were invisible, they were far more terrifying. You could not defend yourself against something you could not see. Naturally, people tried anyway. Protective measures became part of daily life. Small charms were carried or hidden in homes. Certain herbs were believed to ward off evil, hung near doors or burned in fires. Prayers were repeated, not just out of devotion, but as a kind of shield against unseen forces. Even the way a house was built could reflect these fears. Hidden marks carved into beams or doorways, meant to confuse or repel malevolent spirits. But fear, as it often does, led to accusation. When something went wrong, and in Tudor England many things often did, someone had to be blamed. Trials for witchcraft began to appear, where suspicion alone could carry dangerous weight. Evidence was rarely clear. It did not need to be. A pattern of misfortune, combined with a reputation for being different, was often enough to turn whispers into formal charges, and yet there was a strange contradiction at the heart of it all. The same society that feared witches also relied on forms of folk magic. Healers, wise women, and charm makers were sought out for help, even as others were condemned for similar practices, which meant that the line between helpful and harmful was not always clear. In Tudor England, the unseen world was not distant or abstract. It was personal. It lived just beyond sight, shaped by belief, fear, and the quiet suspicion that sometimes misfortune did not happen on its own. In Tudor England, not all signs came from ghosts or witches. Some came from a far higher authority, or at least that's what people believed. The world itself was thought to be a kind of message, constantly speaking through strange events, unusual weather, and moments that felt just a little too deliberate to be coincidence. These were not accidents, they were signs from God, and ignoring them was not considered wise. Storms, for example, were rarely just storms. A sudden, violent thunderstorm could be interpreted as divine anger, a warning that something, somewhere, had gone morally wrong. Lightning striking a building was not just unfortunate, it was specific, targeted, almost as if heaven had made a decision. Comets were even worse. When a comet appeared in the sky, it brought with it a quiet wave of dread. These glowing streaks were seen as omens of major change, often tied to the death of a ruler, the outbreak of war, or a coming disaster. People did not look at them with curiosity. They looked with concern, wondering what exactly had been set into motion. Even small everyday events could carry meaning. A loaf of bread burning unexpectedly, a glass shattering without cause, or a sudden illness in an otherwise healthy person. All could be interpreted as signals. Not random, not meaningless, but deliberate nudges meant to be noticed and understood. Of course, understanding them was the difficult part. Clergy often stepped in to interpret these signs, offering explanations that aligned with religious teachings. But interpretations varied. One event could mean different things to different people, depending on their fears, their hopes, or their current situation, which meant that certainty was always just out of reach. And yet, people continued to search for meaning in everything. Because in a world where God might be communicating through the smallest detail, nothing felt insignificant. Every unusual moment carried weight. Every disruption in routine hinted at something larger, something hidden beneath the surface of daily life. This constant awareness created a quiet tension. Life was not just lived. It was observed, analysed, and interpreted. People watched the skies, listened to the wind, and paid attention to the smallest irregularities, just in case they were being told something important. But there was a subtle problem with this way of thinking. If everything could be a sign, then how could you ever be sure when something truly was? In Tudor England, the search for meaning never really ended. It simply continued, day after day, shaped by a lingering sense that the world was always speaking, and that missing the message might come with consequences no one wanted to face. If daytime in Tudor England was filled with signs and suspicions, nighttime was something else entirely. When the sun disappeared and the last light faded behind timbered rooftops, the world did not simply grow darker, it became uncertain. Familiar places shifted, safe spaces felt less reliable, and whatever people believed might exist beyond sight suddenly felt much closer. Night was when boundaries weakened. Without artificial light, darkness was absolute. A single candle could only illuminate a small circle, leaving everything beyond it swallowed in shadow. And in those shadows, imagination did not need much encouragement. A coat hanging by a door became a figure. A beam of wood stretched across the ceiling took on unfamiliar shapes, and every sound, every creak, every distant movement seemed louder, more deliberate. People avoided being outside after dark whenever possible, not just because of thieves or danger in the ordinary sense, but because night belonged to something else. Spirits were thought to move more freely. Witches, it was said, worked their magic under cover of darkness, and demons, if they existed at all, were unlikely to keep daytime hours. Even inside the home, the sense of safety was not complete. Beds were often shared, rooms crowded, yet sleep did not always come easily. Waking suddenly in the middle of the night was a common and deeply unsettling experience. You might open your eyes to a room that looked almost familiar, but not quite. Shadows stretched in strange directions. The quiet felt too heavy, and for a brief moment, you might wonder if you were truly alone. Some people reported the sensation of being watched. Others spoke of hearing footsteps when no one was awake, or feeling a sudden pressure, as if something unseen had entered the room and chosen not to announce itself. These experiences were rarely dismissed. They were remembered, repeated, and quietly shared. To protect themselves, people relied on routine. Doors were secured carefully. Candles were kept close. Prayers were spoken before sleep, not just as devotion, but as a precaution, a way of marking the space as protected, as watched over. And still, the fear remained, because night had a way of turning certainty into doubt. Things that seemed impossible during the day felt entirely plausible after dark. The world became less solid, less predictable, as if the rules themselves had loosened slightly. In Tudor England, darkness was not empty. It was full of possibilities, of presences, of things that might be there, whether you chose to believe in them or not. And once you had spent enough nights listening to the silence, it became very difficult to trust it again. By the time death finally arrived, and in Tudor England, it rarely waited politely, people were already prepared. Not emotionally, perhaps, but practically. Because death was not just an ending, it was a moment filled with risk. A transition where something could go wrong, where the boundary between worlds was at its thinnest, and where the living had a responsibility to manage what came next. The moment someone died, the atmosphere in the household changed immediately. Windows might be opened, allowing the soul to leave the body freely. This was not symbolic, it was practical. A trapped soul was not a peaceful soul, and no one wanted it lingering longer than necessary. Mirrors were covered, often with cloth. The reasoning was simple, though slightly unsettling. A wandering spirit, confused and newly detached from the body, might become trapped inside reflective surfaces. And once trapped, well, there was no clear agreement on how to get it out again. Clocks were sometimes stopped. Time itself seemed inappropriate in the presence of death, as if continuing to measure it might disturb whatever process was unfolding. The house entered a kind of pause, where normal routines were quietly set aside. Then came the body. It was not left alone. Watching over the dead, what we now call a wake, was an essential part of the process. Family members, neighbours, and sometimes even acquaintances would gather, keeping vigil through the night. On the surface, it appeared to be an act of respect, and it was. But it also served another purpose, to ensure that nothing unexpected happened. Because there was always a concern, however unspoken, that the dead might not remain entirely still. Stories circulated of bodies that shifted, of faint sounds heard in otherwise silent rooms. Whether these were real events, or the product of exhausted minds in candlelit spaces, hardly mattered. The possibility alone was enough to justify constant watchfulness. Protective objects were sometimes placed near the body. Herbs, small tokens, or religious items, all meant to guide the soul safely away and prevent anything from interfering with its journey. Prayers were repeated, not just for comfort, but as a form of control, a way of ensuring that the situation remained, as much as possible, under human influence. And yet, despite all these precautions, uncertainty lingered. Because no matter how carefully the rituals were followed, no one could say with complete confidence what happened in those unseen moments between death and whatever came after. In Tudor England, death was not just feared, it was managed, carefully, cautiously, and with the quiet understanding that if handled incorrectly, it might not stay neatly contained. By now, ghost stories were not just whispers in small villages, or fears shared in candlelit rooms. Some had names, some had places, and a few became so well known that they outlived the people who first told them. In Tudor England, certain hauntings gained a reputation, the kind that made even the most sceptical pause slightly when walking past a particular doorway. Perhaps the most famous of all was the ghost of Anne Boleyn. Executed in 1536, her death was swift, political, and, by many accounts, deeply unjust, which, in Tudor logic, made her an ideal candidate for returning. Stories claimed she was seen walking the grounds of Tower of London, sometimes carrying her head beneath her arm. A dramatic detail, yes, but Tudor ghosts were not known for subtlety. Witnesses described her as calm, almost distant, as if still caught in the final moments of her life. Whether these sightings were real or not mattered less than the effect they had. The Tower, already a place associated with imprisonment and execution, gained an additional layer of unease. It was no longer just a historical site. It was, potentially, still occupied. Then there was Catherine Howard, another queen whose life ended abruptly within those same walls. Her ghost was said to appear not in silence but in motion, running, screaming, reliving the desperate moments before her execution. According to legend, she could be heard racing down corridors, as if trying, unsuccessfully, to escape a fate that had already been sealed. Not all hauntings were royal, but royal ones tended to receive better publicity. In grand houses across England, families passed down stories of figures seen at windows, of footsteps heard in rooms long unused, of doors opening just enough to suggest intention. These were not always tied to famous names, but they carried a similar weight. A history of betrayal, loss, or sudden death often seemed to leave behind more than just memory. Interestingly, these stories were not always told with fear alone. There was, at times, a strange familiarity to them. A ghost could become part of a household's identity, something to mention, to warn about, perhaps even to accept. Yes, that corridor is avoided at night, but only because of the usual reasons, which, if anything, made it all feel slightly more unsettling. Because when a ghost story becomes normal, when it shifts from shocking to expected, it suggests something deeper. Not just a fear of the unknown, but a quiet acceptance that the past does not always stay where it should. And in Tudor England, it rarely did. By the end of it all, Tudor life was not defined by a single belief, but by a constant balancing act between fear and faith. Ghosts, omens, curses, divine signs, none of these existed in isolation. They formed a quiet background to everyday life, shaping decisions, influencing behaviour, and lingering just beneath the surface of even the most ordinary moments. People still worked, traded, cooked, argued, and laughed. Life did not stop simply because the night felt watched, or because a bird flew too close to a window. But everything carried an added layer of awareness, a sense that the visible world was only part of the story. Faith, for many, was the anchor. Prayer was not just ritual, it was protection. Churches were not just places of worship. They were spaces where order could be restored, where the chaos of unseen forces could be momentarily pushed back. Even as religious beliefs shifted during the Tudor period, the need for reassurance remained constant. At the same time, fear never fully disappeared. It adapted. It settled into routines. People learned how to live alongside it, the same way one might learn to ignore a persistent draft in an old house. You notice it, you adjust to it, but you never quite forget it's there. A strange noise at night might be dismissed, but only after a brief pause. A shadow might be ignored, but not without a second glance. Children grew up hearing these stories, absorbing them as part of their understanding of the world. By the time they reached adulthood, the idea that something unseen might be present was not unusual. It was expected. Fear was not always dramatic. It was subtle, woven into habits and small precautions. And yet there was also comfort in it. So, because if spirits existed, if signs carried meaning, if the world was filled with messages and presences, then life was not random. It was connected, purposeful, watched over, even if that attention was not always friendly. The same beliefs that caused fear also offered a strange kind of reassurance. Nothing happened without reason. Of course, whether those reasons were truly understood was another matter entirely. In Tudor England, people did not conquer their fears of the unseen. They learned to live with them, to interpret them, to navigate a world where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were never entirely clear. And perhaps that is what defined the era most of all. Not the ghosts themselves, but the quiet certainty that something might always be just out of sight, waiting to be noticed. Before a Roman emperor took a single bite, someone else already had. That someone was the pregustator, the taste tester. A slave whose job description was brutally simple: eat first and hope nothing happens. Because if something did happen, that was the entire point. Poison was one of the most feared weapons in ancient Rome. Not loud like a dagger, not dramatic like a battlefield, but quiet, invisible, and incredibly effective. A single contaminated dish could end a life before anyone even realized what had happened. And in a world where power meant enemies, and enemies meant constant plotting, emperors did not rely on luck. They relied on someone else's expendability. Enter the praegustatores. These were not honoured servants or trusted advisors. They were human shields in the most literal sense, placed between the emperor and death itself. Every meal, every drink, every carefully prepared delicacy passed through them first. They tasted everything. Wine, bread, meat, sauces. Nothing was spared. And then, everyone watched. Because the most important part of their job was not the tasting, it was the waiting. A few seconds, a minute, long enough to see if anything went wrong. If the taster remained alive, the emperor would proceed. If not, well, the system had worked exactly as intended. What makes this even more unsettling is how normal it became. This was not an emergency measure used in rare circumstances. It was routine. Daily life at the imperial court included the quiet understanding that someone might need to die before dinner could safely begin. And yet, these individuals were not random victims selected moments before a meal. Many pregustatores were assigned specifically for this role. They trained for it. They lived with it. Which raises a rather uncomfortable question. What does it feel like to wake up every morning knowing your job is to potentially die before lunch? Because in Roman society, survival was not evenly distributed. At the very top sat the emperor, surrounded by luxury, guarded by layers of protection, and at the very bottom, someone had to absorb the risk. The pregustator was that person, not a hero, not a martyr, just a necessary sacrifice in a system where trust was dangerous, and caution came at a human cost. And once you understand that, every Roman banquet starts to look a little different. That first bite was never just about food. It was about survival in a court where trust was considered almost naive, because the Roman imperial court was not a stable, predictable environment. It was a place of ambition, rivalry, and carefully hidden intentions. Every smile could mean loyalty or calculation. Every gesture of respect might carry something else beneath it. And in that atmosphere, poison became the perfect weapon. It required no confrontation, no raised voice, no drawn blade, just patience. Food, after all, was unavoidable. Even the most powerful man in the empire had to eat, which made every meal an opportunity, not just for nourishment, but for assassination. And the more powerful the emperor, the more people had a reason to see him removed. Political rivals, disgruntled senators, even members of the imperial household. Especially members of the imperial household, because danger did not always come from outside. In many cases, it came from within, from those closest to power. Family members, advisors, servants, all had access, all had proximity. And in a system where succession could be unclear, removing an emperor was sometimes seen less as a crime and more as a strategic decision, which meant paranoia was not a flaw. It was a survival skill. Emperors learned to expect betrayal, not occasionally, but constantly. Meals were prepared with care, yes, but also with suspicion. Kitchens were watched, servants were monitored, ingredients were scrutinized, and even then, there was always the lingering possibility that something had slipped through. That is where the pregustatores became essential. They were not just there to taste food. They were there to absorb uncertainty, to stand in that fragile gap between preparation and consumption, between trust and doubt. Their presence allowed the emperor to eat with something resembling confidence, even if that confidence was borrowed. But even this system had its limits. Because what if the poison was slow? What if it did not act immediately, but quietly, over time? A taster might survive the first moments, only for the true effects to appear later, which meant that even after the pregustator had done their job, uncertainty remained, and that uncertainty shaped everything. Meals were no longer simple routines. They became controlled events, observed, measured, calculated. The act of eating, something so basic, so universal, turned into a careful negotiation with risk. In a court like this, trust was not given. It was tested. And even then, it was never entirely certain. So who exactly became a pregustator? Not volunteers. Not ambitious young Romans dreaming of career advancement. No, this role was almost always filled by slaves. Individuals whose lives were already considered property, whose value was measured not in comfort or safety, but in usefulness. And few roles were more brutally useful than this. A pregustator's life was built around proximity to power, but without any of the protection that usually came with it. They lived close to the emperor's household, often within the palace itself, always available, always ready. Their routine revolved around meals, not their own, but someone else's. They did not choose what they ate. They did not ask questions. A dish was presented, and they consumed it. Then they waited. That waiting became a kind of silent ritual. A pause filled with tension, where every sensation mattered. A slight bitterness, an unusual aftertaste, a sudden warmth in the throat. Any of these could mean something, or nothing. And the worst part was that there was no clear way to know which, because poison did not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it was immediate, a violent reaction, a visible collapse. But often it was slower, subtle, a creeping discomfort that grew over time, which meant that a praegustator could pass the initial test only to suffer the consequences later, long after the emperor had safely finished his meal. In other words, survival in the moment did not guarantee survival at all. And yet, this was their daily reality. Some may have developed a kind of grim awareness, learning to recognize certain flavors or signs. Others likely relied on routine, pushing aside fear simply to function. Because if you allowed yourself to fully consider the risk every time you lifted food to your mouth, you might never lift it at all. There is also the question of status. Compared to other slaves, praegustatores occupied a strange position. They were close to power, which could bring small privileges, better living conditions, perhaps slightly more recognition. But that proximity came at a cost, because they were also closer to danger than almost anyone else in the empire. They existed in a narrow space between importance and expendability, needed but not valued, and perhaps that is what defined their role most clearly. Not just the act of tasting food, but the quiet understanding that their safety was never the priority. Their purpose was to stand in front of risk, to meet it first, absorb it if necessary, and in doing so, ensure that someone else could continue living. In Rome, that was enough. To understand why praegustatores existed, you have to understand the thing they were protecting against. And in ancient Rome, few threats were as feared, or as effective, as poison. Unlike a dagger, poison did not require strength. Unlike a public execution, it did not require witnesses. It worked quietly, often invisibly, and in many cases it left just enough ambiguity to raise suspicion, but not enough to prove anything, which made it perfect. Poisons came in many forms. Some were fast, causing violent reactions that could not be mistaken for anything natural. Others were slow, subtle, designed to mimic illness. A fever, a weakness, a gradual decline. All could be explained away as natural causes, especially in a time when medical understanding was limited. This ambiguity was not a flaw, it was the entire strategy. Because in a political environment like Rome, being able to remove someone without openly taking responsibility was incredibly valuable. An emperor could die, and questions would follow, but answers were far less certain. And in that uncertainty, power could shift quickly. Food and drink became the most convenient delivery system. A cup of wine, a carefully prepared dish, a sauce with just the right balance of flavour, and something else. It did not take much, and once the poison was consumed, the outcome was often unavoidable, which is why the act of eating became so dangerous. Even emperors, surrounded by guards and layers of security, were vulnerable at the table. You could protect a man from blades and arrows, but how do you protect him from something already on his plate? The answer, of course, was to let someone else try it first. But even this solution was not perfect. Some poisons were designed specifically to evade detection. Tasteless, odourless, delayed. A praegustator might consume the food and show no immediate reaction, giving the emperor a false sense of safety. Hours later, the effects would appear, but by then, the meal had already been eaten, which meant that poison was not just a weapon, it was a game, a constant back and forth between those who sought to use it and those who tried to defend against it. Each side adapting, evolving, finding new ways to outmaneuver the other. And in the middle of that game stood the praegustator, not as a player, but as a buffer. A test. A necessary step between suspicion and certainty, because in Rome, death did not always arrive with noise or warning. Sometimes it arrived quietly, disguised as something harmless, waiting patiently to be consumed. By the time you reach the height of Roman power, the fear of poison is no longer theoretical. It becomes personal. And for some emperors, it becomes an obsession. Take Claudius, for example. His reign was marked by political intrigue, shifting loyalties, and a court that seemed permanently on edge. According to ancient sources, his death itself may have come from poisoned food, allegedly prepared under the influence of his own wife, Agrippina the Younger. Whether every detail is accurate or not is almost beside the point. The story reflects something deeper, the belief that even an emperor could be quietly removed at his own dinner table. Then there is Nero, who grew up in that same atmosphere of suspicion. By the time he ruled, trust was not just limited, it was nearly non-existent. Food, drink, even the people serving it, were all potential threats. And when you begin to suspect everyone around you, protection becomes less about security and more about control. Some emperors took this to extremes. Meals were tightly regulated, dishes were inspected repeatedly. The same foods might be prepared multiple times in different ways, just to reduce the risk of tampering. And of course, pregustatores were always present, tasting, waiting, existing in that uncomfortable space between caution and consequence. But fear does something interesting when it lasts long enough. It changes behavior. Eating, which should be a moment of rest or pleasure, became tense, calculated. Emperors did not simply enjoy their meals, they observed them, studied them. Every bite came with a moment of hesitation, however small, because even with all precautions in place, certainty was never guaranteed. And then there's the psychological weight of it all. Imagine knowing that someone must risk their life before you can safely take a sip of wine. Imagine watching them closely, not out of concern for them, but for yourself, waiting to see if they remain standing. It creates a strange dynamic. The emperor's safety depends entirely on another person's vulnerability, which is not exactly comforting. Over time, this constant vigilance could blur the line between caution and paranoia. When every meal carries risk and every person might have a motive, trust becomes almost impossible to maintain. And without trust, even the most powerful individual begins to feel exposed, because power in Rome did not eliminate danger. It attracted it. And at the imperial table, surrounded by luxury and ceremony, that danger was always present, quiet, patient, and often just one bite away. For all its precautions, all its routines, and all the lives placed between emperors and danger, the system was not perfect. It could not be. Because in a world built on suspicion, even the safeguards themselves could become part of the problem. The pregustator was meant to create certainty. Taste the food, wait, confirm safety. Simple in theory, but reality had a way of complicating even the most carefully designed protections. Because what if the taster was compromised? A pregustator was still a human being, or more accurately, a human being with very limited power and very clear vulnerability. They could be bribed, threatened, promised something better than their current existence, which admittedly was not a high bar. If someone wanted to bypass the system, influencing the person meant to test the food was not an unreasonable strategy, and if the taster chose not to report something, who would know? Then there was the issue of timing. Not all poisons worked immediately. Some were designed to act slowly, slipping past the initial observation period. A pregustator might eat, show no visible reaction, and the emperor would proceed with confidence. Hours later, the effects would begin. By then, the protection had already failed, just not in a way that was immediately obvious, which made every successful test slightly unreliable. And then there were cases where suspicion itself disrupted the system. If an emperor began to doubt the loyalty of those around him, even the pregustator could become a source of anxiety. The very person meant to ensure safety could be seen as another potential threat. And once that doubt takes hold, the system begins to unravel, because a safeguard only works if it is trusted. History offers several examples of emperors who died under suspicious circumstances, despite the presence of precautions. Whether it was truly poison or not is often debated, but the fact that poison was immediately suspected tells you everything about the environment they lived in. No death was entirely natural, not at that level of power, and when the system failed, it failed quietly. There was no dramatic moment where everything collapsed, just a realization, often too late, that something had slipped through. A meal that had seemed safe, a routine that had been followed, a test that had been passed, and yet the outcome remained the same. which is perhaps the most unsettling part of all. Because even with someone else taking the first risk, even with layers of caution and control, the Emperor was never truly safe. The system reduced danger, but it never removed it. In Rome, survival was never guaranteed. It was simply delayed until it wasn't. At first glance, the life of a praegustator might seem almost fortunate. Compared to other slaves, they were closer to power, closer to comfort, closer to the centre of the Roman world. They lived within imperial residences, handled fine food, and operated in spaces most people would never even see. But proximity to power does not always mean safety. In fact, in this case, it meant the opposite. It meant, because while other slaves laboured in fields or workshops, their risks were at least predictable. Hard work, yes. Punishment, possibly. But not a daily confrontation with something designed to kill. The praegustator, on the other hand, faced a quieter, more constant danger, one that arrived neatly prepared, carefully plated, and impossible to avoid. And unlike a single moment of danger, this was repetitive. Every meal carried the same question. Not, will something happen today, but could it happen this time? The uncertainty did not come in bursts. It lingered. It became part of the rhythm of life, a background tension that never quite disappeared, which leads to an uncomfortable thought. Was this position actually a privilege, or just a slower, more controlled way of risking death? There were, of course, small advantages. Being close to the Emperor meant better food, at least in quality, if not in safety. It meant access to a different level of life, perhaps even a degree of recognition within the household. A praegustator might be known, seen, acknowledged in ways that other slaves were not. But recognition does not cancel out risk. If anything, it sharpens it. Because the more important your role, the more consistently you are placed in danger. And the praegustator's role was essential, which meant they could not be easily replaced, but they also could not be removed from the system. Their presence was required, their function unavoidable. So they remained, day after day, meal after meal. And perhaps the most difficult part was not the danger itself, but the lack of control over it. A soldier could prepare for battle. A gladiator could train for the arena. But a praegustator, their moment of risk came without warning, disguised as routine. There was no build-up, no clear signal. Just a plate, a cup, and the expectation that they would proceed. And they did, because they had no real choice. In Rome, survival was often about status. The higher you stood, the more protection you had. But the praegustator existed in a strange exception to that rule, close enough to power to matter, yet far enough to remain expendable, not quite protected, not entirely forgotten, just positioned carefully, between danger and someone more important. By this point, the mechanics of the system are clear. Food is tested, risk is absorbed, the Emperor eats. But what is less obvious, and perhaps far more unsettling, is what this does to the mind. Because when every meal carries the possibility of death, eating is no longer a simple act. It becomes a psychological exercise. For the Emperor, the presence of a praegustator was meant to create reassurance, a visible layer of protection. Someone else takes the first bite. Someone else waits. And if nothing happens, the path appears safe. But reassurance is not the same as certainty. And when your life depends on someone else's reaction, doubt never fully disappears. You watch them. Not casually, but carefully. You notice how they chew, how they swallow, how they breathe afterward. A pause that is slightly too long. A movement that seems just a bit off. Any of these could trigger hesitation. And in that moment, the entire meal stalls, suspended between safety and suspicion. Even if nothing happens, the thought lingers. What if this is the slow kind? Because the most dangerous poisons are not the obvious ones. They do not announce themselves immediately. They wait. Quietly. Patiently. And that knowledge changes everything. It means that even after the praegustator has done their job, Even after the emperor has taken the first bite, the question remains unresolved. Is it actually safe, or just not yet dangerous? Over time, this kind of thinking reshapes behavior. Eating becomes slower, more deliberate, not out of elegance, but out of caution. Each bite is measured, each sip considered. What should be a moment of comfort becomes something closer to observation. And then there is the emotional distance. Because in order for the system to work, the emperor must accept something deeply uncomfortable, that another person's life is secondary to his own safety. The praegustator is not there as a companion, not as a trusted ally, but as a buffer, a necessary step in the process, which creates a strange dynamic. You rely on them completely, but you cannot afford to think about them too much, because if you do, if you allow yourself to fully acknowledge what their role actually means, the act of eating becomes harder, not easier. It introduces a weight that is difficult to ignore, a quiet awareness that your safety is built on someone else's risk. So, most likely, that awareness is pushed aside, not eliminated, but managed. Because in a court where survival depends on constant vigilance, there is little room for hesitation. The system must function, the meal must continue, and whatever thoughts arise in the process must remain unspoken. In Rome, even something as simple as eating required a careful balance, not just of safety, but of what you allowed yourself to feel. In the end, the story of the praegustator is not really about food. It is about power, and what it costs to hold on to it. Because at the top of Roman society, survival was never guaranteed. It had to be managed, defended, and constantly negotiated. Enemies were not always visible. Threats did not always arrive with warning. And in that environment, every possible precaution became not just reasonable, but necessary. Even if that precaution meant placing another human life directly in harm's way. The praegustator represents a system where risk is not eliminated, but transferred. The emperor does not remove danger from his world. He redirects it, moves it slightly to the side, just far enough that it reaches someone else first. And once you see it that way, the role becomes something larger than a single job. It becomes a symbol, a reminder that in Rome, power was built on layers, and at the bottom of those layers were people whose safety was never part of the equation. The praegustator stood at that boundary, where protection for one depended entirely on exposure for another. What makes this even more striking is how accepted it was. There is no evidence of widespread outrage, no grand debates about morality. The system existed because it worked, and because it fit neatly into the structure of Roman society. Slaves were expected to serve. The emperor was expected to survive. The rest followed logically, if not comfortably. And yet, there is something deeply human in the tension it creates. Because even in a world where hierarchy was unquestioned, the act itself carries weight. Watching another person risk their life before you take a sip of wine is not something that can be entirely ignored. It lingers, whether acknowledged or not. Perhaps that is why the system feels so unsettling, even now. Not because it is unfamiliar, but because it is, in a way, understandable. Faced with constant threat, people will do what they must to survive. They will build systems, create safeguards, and find ways to reduce risk. The question is simply where that risk ends up. In ancient Rome, it ended up on the plate in front of the praegustator. And every time they took that first bite, they were not just testing food. They were absorbing the uncertainty of an entire system. One built on ambition, fear, and the quiet acceptance that survival at the top often depends on sacrifice at the bottom. A system where, quite literally, someone else had to eat first, so someone more important could keep living. Before the American mafia became a symbol of power, money, and violence, it began quietly, carried across the Atlantic in the minds, habits, and survival instincts of immigrants arriving in a new world. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, waves of Italians arrived in cities like New York, Chicago, and New Orleans. They came looking for opportunity, But what they found was something far less welcoming. Poverty, discrimination, overcrowded neighborhoods, and limited access to jobs created an environment where survival often depended on community, and sometimes on bending the rules. Within these tight-knit immigrant communities, familiar structures began to reappear. Old world traditions from Sicily and southern Italy did not simply disappear upon arrival. They adapted. Informal systems of protection, loyalty, and silence, concepts that would later define organized crime, found fertile ground in these new urban environments. When official systems failed to protect them, people turned to those who would. And those protectors quickly realized something very important. Power could be built in the shadows. Small groups formed, offering services both legal and illegal. Protection from other gangs, assistance with disputes, access to jobs, housing, or opportunities that were otherwise out of reach. But these services came with a price: loyalty, obedience, and often money. At first, these groups were fragmented, local, disorganized, more about survival than empire. But the foundation was there: a shared identity, a code of silence, a willingness to operate outside the law, and perhaps most importantly, a growing understanding that fear could be just as valuable as respect. As cities expanded and communities grew, so did these networks. What began as scattered groups slowly started to resemble something more structured, more intentional. Leaders emerged, territories formed, rules were established, and beneath it all, a quiet transformation was taking place. This was no longer just about surviving in a new country. It was about controlling it, piece by piece. The American Mafia did not appear overnight. It evolved, shaped by circumstance, opportunity, and the constant tension between exclusion and ambition. And as the stage was set, all it needed was the right moment to step out of the shadows and into something far more powerful. Before the American Mafia became a symbol of power, wealth, and quiet violence, it began in far less glamorous conditions: crowded tenements, noisy docks, and neighborhoods where survival was never guaranteed. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thousands of Italian immigrants arrived in the United States, especially in cities like New York, Chicago, and New Orleans. They came with hope, but quickly encountered a harsher reality. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, and discrimination was constant. Many were pushed into tightly packed neighborhoods where opportunity felt distant and the law felt unreliable. And when the system does not protect you, you build your own. Within these immigrant communities, familiar structures began to re-emerge. Many of these newcomers came from regions in southern Italy and Sicily, where authority had long been weak or distrusted. In those places, people relied on informal networks, loyalty, family ties, and sometimes intimidation, to solve problems and ensure safety. Those habits did not disappear in America. They adapted. At first, these networks were small and practical. A man who could handle problems. Someone who could recover stolen goods, settle disputes, or ensure that your shop was not mysteriously damaged overnight. These figures were not yet powerful crime bosses. They were intermediaries, operating in the grey space between legality and necessity. But there was a pattern forming. Protection was offered, but never freely. Disputes were resolved, but not without cost. And over time, these small arrangements began to evolve into something more organised. Groups formed around strong personalities. Territories became understood, even if never formally declared. And a quiet code developed. Loyalty above all, silence when necessary. Because silence was power. The more these networks operated unseen, the stronger they became. Authorities often ignored them, misunderstood them, or simply lacked the access to penetrate these close-knit communities, which allowed these groups to grow without much interference. And growth brought ambition. What began as localized survival slowly transformed into structured influence. These were no longer just men solving neighborhood problems. They were building systems that could control money, labor, and eventually entire industries. The American Mafia did not arrive fully formed. It was built piece by piece, shaped by exclusion, necessity, and opportunity. And by the time anyone truly noticed what it had become, it was already too deeply rooted to easily remove. If the early Mafia was built on survival, Prohibition turned it into an empire. In 1920, the United States made a decision that would unintentionally reshape organized crime forever. The government banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol. Overnight, something millions of people wanted became illegal. And when demand stays high but supply becomes forbidden, someone steps in to fill the gap. That someone was the Mafia. At first, it was simple: smuggling alcohol from Canada, producing it illegally in hidden distilleries, selling it quietly through back channels. But quietly did not last long. The demand was too massive, the profits too tempting. What started as small operations quickly exploded into large, coordinated networks, moving enormous quantities of liquor across cities and state lines. Suddenly, crime was no longer just about survival. It was about business. Speakeasies, illegal bars hidden behind unmarked doors, began to appear everywhere. And they were not shady little corners. Many were vibrant, crowded, even glamorous. Music, dancing, expensive drinks. Ordinary people, politicians and celebrities all found their way inside. And behind all of it, organized crime controlled the supply. Figures like Al Capone rose to prominence during this period, not because they invented crime, but because they industrialized it. Bootlegging became a full-scale operation, with logistics, distribution chains, and enforcement mechanisms to protect profits. Because competition did not disappear, it intensified. Different groups fought over territory, routes, and control of the most profitable markets. Violence became more frequent, more public, and more calculated. Shootings were not random, they were business decisions. Remove a rival, secure the flow of income, and with money came influence. Massive profits allowed these organizations to do something even more dangerous than selling illegal alcohol. They began to corrupt the system itself. Police officers could be bribed. Politicians could be influenced. Entire neighborhoods could operate under a kind of unofficial control where the law existed, but was not always enforced, which created a strange reality. Alcohol was illegal on paper, but in practice it was everywhere, just controlled by the Mafia. Prohibition did not eliminate drinking, it handed it to organized crime, and by the time the law was eventually repealed, the damage, or from the Mafia's perspective, the opportunity, had already done its work. These groups were no longer small, fragmented networks. They were powerful, wealthy, and deeply embedded. What had once been survival had now become dominance. With Prohibition pouring money into the system, the Mafia did not just grow, it collided with itself. Because when profits become enormous, cooperation becomes fragile. Different groups, often operating in the same cities, began to compete for control. Bootlegging routes, distribution networks, entire neighborhoods, everything had value. And unlike legitimate businesses, there were no courts to settle disputes, no contracts to enforce agreements, only force. What followed was a period where violence became not just common, but expected. Organized crime moved out of the shadows and into the streets, where conflicts were settled quickly and publicly. Gunfire in broad daylight, explosions outside businesses, bodies left as warnings. This was not chaos, it was strategy. Violence sent messages. It showed strength, discouraged rivals, and reinforced control. If one group could demonstrate that crossing them came with immediate consequences, they gained an advantage. Fear became a tool, just as valuable as money. In cities like Chicago, this dynamic reached its peak. Rival gangs battled for dominance, turning the city into something closer to a battlefield than a business environment. And at the center of it all stood figures like Al Capone, whose name became almost synonymous with organized crime itself. Capone did not just participate in this world, he shaped it. He understood that visibility, while dangerous, could also be powerful. His operations were vast, his influence undeniable, and his willingness to use force made him both feared and, strangely, admired by some. But this visibility came with consequences. The more public the violence became, the harder it was for authorities to ignore. Events like the St. Valentine's Day massacre, where rival gang members were executed in a carefully staged ambush, shocked the public. Not because violence was new, but because of how organized, how deliberate, and how brazen it had become. It revealed something unsettling. This was not random crime. It was structured, calculated, almost corporate in its execution. And that realization changed everything. Because once the public began to see organized crime as a system rather than isolated incidents, pressure on law enforcement increased. The mafia was no longer just a hidden network operating quietly in the background. It had become visible, famous, and dangerously effective. But while the violence drew attention, it also forced a realization within the mafia itself. Endless conflict was bad for business. Too much chaos threatened profits, which meant that sooner or later, something would have to change. By the early 1930s, one thing had become painfully clear. Constant violence was bad for business. The mafia had grown rich during Prohibition, but it had also become unstable. Rivalries, betrayals, and endless turf wars were cutting into profits and attracting unwanted attention. Leaders were being killed, alliances shifting overnight, and entire operations collapsing simply because no one could agree on who was in charge. And into that chaos stepped Lucky Luciano. Unlike many of his predecessors, Luciano was not interested in old traditions for the sake of tradition. He was pragmatic, strategic, and most importantly, he understood that the future of organized crime was not in constant fighting, but in cooperation. At the time, the mafia in New York was divided into factions, many still tied to old Sicilian loyalties. This led to internal conflict, most notably the Castellamarese War, a brutal power struggle between rival bosses. It was violent, unpredictable, and, from Luciano's perspective, completely unnecessary. So he did something radical. He ended it. Luciano orchestrated the removal of the old leadership, figures who clung to outdated rivalries and refused to adapt. In their place, he introduced a new structure, one that treated organized crime less like a feud and more like a business. The result was the creation of what became known as the Commission. This was not a single boss ruling over all, but a governing body made up of leaders from different families. Decisions could be discussed. Disputes could be managed without immediate violence. Territory could be respected. In theory, it created balance. In practice, it created efficiency. New York was reorganized into the 5 families, each with defined leadership and areas of influence. Instead of constant war, there was coordination. Instead of unpredictable conflict, there were rules. Of course, violence did not disappear, but it became controlled, targeted, used when necessary, not constantly, which allowed the mafia to focus on what it had become exceptionally good at, making money. Luciano's approach transformed organized crime from a loose collection of competing gangs into a structured network. It expanded beyond bootlegging into gambling, labor racketeering, and other industries that could generate steady income without drawing as much attention. In short, he modernized it. What makes this shift so important is not just the reduction of violence, but the change in mindset. The mafia was no longer just about power through fear. It was about power through organization, and that made it far more dangerous. Because once chaos is replaced with structure, growth becomes easier, expansion becomes possible, and a system that once struggled to control itself suddenly finds a way to control everything around it. Luciano did not invent the mafia. He made it work. Once the violence was controlled and the structure stabilized, the mafia faced a new question. What comes after Prohibition? Because when alcohol became legal again in 1933, one of their biggest revenue streams disappeared overnight. Not entirely. There was still money to be made. But the easy, massive profits were gone, and organizations that had grown used to that level of income needed something to replace it. So they adapted. The mafia did not retreat back into the shadows. It expanded outward, into industries that looked legitimate on the surface, but could be quietly controlled from behind the scenes. Gambling was one of the first major moves. Illegal betting operations had always existed, but now they became more organized, more widespread, and more profitable. Numbers games, underground casinos, sports betting, all provided steady income with relatively low risk compared to the chaos of Prohibition-era bootlegging. But the real power came from something less obvious: labor unions. By infiltrating unions, mafia figures gained influence over entire industries: construction, transportation, shipping. If you controlled the union, you could control who worked, when they worked, and at what cost. Strikes could be encouraged or avoided. Contracts could be influenced. Businesses that cooperated could operate smoothly. Those that resisted often found themselves facing delays, disruptions, or worse. It was control without visibility. And then there was Las Vegas. What began as a desert town slowly transformed into a center of legalized gambling, and the mafia recognized the opportunity immediately. Instead of operating entirely outside the law, they could now operate alongside it. Casinos became the perfect front, legitimate businesses that generated enormous amounts of cash. Figures connected to the mafia helped finance, build, and manage early casinos, turning Las Vegas into a hub where illegal money could flow through legal channels. Profits were skimmed, quietly redirected, and reinvested, which meant the system had evolved again. The mafia was no longer just an underground network. It was intertwined with the visible economy. Businesses, unions, entertainment, all connected in ways that were not always obvious to the outside world, and that made it harder to detect, because the more legitimate something looks, the less people question it. A casino is just a casino. A union is just a union. A business deal is just a business deal, until you look closer. What makes this phase so important is that the mafia learned how to operate in two worlds at once. One visible, one hidden, one legal, one not. And by balancing both, they became something far more powerful than before. Not just criminals, but a system embedded within the system itself. As the mafia expanded into legitimate industries, something unexpected began to happen. It started to look respectable. Not openly, of course. No one was publicly announcing connections or holding press conferences about organized crime. But behind the scenes, influence began to reach places that were once considered far removed from the underworld: politics, entertainment, and high society. And once you enter those spaces, perception changes. In politics, the relationship was simple, if unspoken. The mafia had money and influence. Politicians needed both. Campaigns required funding. Elections required organization. Votes could be influenced in certain neighborhoods where loyalty mattered more than ideology. And in return, protection. Investigations could be slowed. Attention could be redirected. Laws could be enforced, selectively. It was not about controlling the entire system, just enough of it to create breathing room, which, for an organization built on avoiding scrutiny, was incredibly valuable. Then there was Hollywood. The connection between organized crime and the film industry has always been surrounded by rumor and partial truths. But what is clear is that influence extended there as well, particularly through labor unions and production logistics. Control over workers meant control over production schedules. And in an industry where time is money, that kind of leverage mattered. If a studio cooperated, things ran smoothly. If not, delays could appear. Problems could emerge. Not always dramatic, not always obvious. Just enough to make a point. But beyond influence, there was something else. Image. Hollywood began to shape how the public saw organized crime. Not as chaotic street violence, but as something more structured, even glamorous. Well-dressed men, expensive cars, quiet conversations in dimly lit rooms, power but refined, which, whether intentional or not, helped soften the perception. The mafia was no longer just something to fear. It became something to watch, to be curious about, even to admire in certain circles, a dangerous shift, because it blurred the reality of what was actually happening behind that polished surface, because underneath the suits and the influence, the system had not changed. It was still built on control, intimidation, and the quiet threat of force when necessary. But now, it was wrapped in something more acceptable, and that made it harder to confront. Because it is one thing to fight something that is clearly outside the system. It is much more difficult to deal with something that has learned how to blend into it, to operate within it, to influence it, and occasionally, to look like it belongs there. By this point, the mafia was no longer just in America. In many ways, it had become part of it. For years, the mafia had operated in a space that was difficult to define. Not fully hidden, but not fully exposed either. Everyone seemed to know it existed, yet proving it, dismantling it, or even officially acknowledging its structure proved far more complicated. That began to change in the mid-20th century, because eventually the visibility, the influence, and the sheer scale of organized crime became impossible to ignore. Public concern grew, journalists began asking sharper questions, and slowly, the government was forced to respond, not with assumptions, but with evidence. One of the turning points came with the work of figures like J. Edgar Hoover. For years, Hoover had been criticized for downplaying the existence of a national organized crime network. But as pressure mounted, investigations intensified, surveillance increased, and the idea of the mafia as a coordinated nationwide system began to take shape in official reports. Then came something even more impactful: witnesses. For a long time, one of the mafia's greatest strengths had been silence. The code of omertà, the refusal to cooperate with authorities, made it incredibly difficult to build cases. People did not talk, and without testimony, even the most obvious patterns remained legally out of reach. But that silence began to crack. Individuals within the system started to cooperate, offering insight into how the organization actually functioned. Structures, roles, operations, details that had once been hidden became visible, and once exposed, they could be targeted. This led to new legal strategies. Instead of prosecuting individual crimes in isolation, authorities began to focus on the organization itself. Laws like the RICO Act allowed prosecutors to connect multiple activities under a single framework, making it possible to hold leaders accountable for actions carried out by the entire network. And that changed everything. Because for the first time, being at the top no longer guaranteed safety. Distance from the crime was no longer protection. The structure that had made the mafia so effective now became something that could be used against it. Arrests increased. Trials gained attention. Convictions began to weaken the organization from within. But the response was not immediate collapse. The mafia had adapted before, and it adapted again. Operations became quieter, more cautious, less visible. The overt displays of power that had once defined it began to fade, replaced by a more restrained approach, still present, still active, just harder to see. What makes this phase so significant is not that the mafia disappeared. It didn't. It's that for the first time, the balance shifted. The system that had once operated with confidence now had to operate carefully. And in a world where visibility had once been a strength, invisibility became a necessity, because the game had changed. And now, both sides were playing to win. By the late 20th century, the mafia was no longer what it had once been. The structure still existed. The names still carried weight. But something had changed. Not suddenly, but gradually. Pressure from law enforcement, internal betrayals, and shifting economic landscapes began to reshape the organization in ways that could not be easily reversed. The era of open dominance was over. High-profile figures, once untouchable, were now being arrested and convicted. Court cases exposed internal operations. Former members turned informants, revealing details that had been protected for decades. The code of silence, once absolute, weakened under pressure. And once that silence breaks, it rarely fully recovers. At the same time, the environment itself was changing. Traditional rackets became less reliable. Labour unions were no longer as easily controlled. Increased regulation, better oversight, and changing industries reduced the influence the mafia once held in key sectors. Even Las Vegas, once a stronghold, shifted toward corporate ownership, pushing organised crime further into the background. Which meant adaptation was no longer optional. It was necessary. The mafia began to move away from visibility and toward subtlety. Instead of large, centralized operations, activities became more fragmented. Smaller groups, quieter transactions, less public violence. The goal was no longer to dominate openly, but to operate efficiently without attracting attention. In many ways, it returned to something closer to its origins. Less spectacle, more discretion. But the world it operated in was different now. Technology made surveillance easier. Financial systems were more transparent. Communication was harder to keep private. The same tools that allowed society to grow also made it more difficult for hidden networks to remain entirely hidden, which created a new kind of tension. The mafia still existed, but it no longer defined the underworld the way it once had. Other forms of organized crime emerged, different structures, different methods, often less tied to tradition and more focused on flexibility. The old model was no longer the only one, and perhaps that is the most telling sign of change. Because decline does not always mean disappearance. Sometimes it means losing centrality, losing the position of being the dominant force, becoming one part of a much larger, more complex landscape. The mafia adapted, survived, and continued in quieter forms. But the days of being the shadow power behind entire cities, the unseen force shaping industries, politics, and public life, began to fade. Not completely, but enough to mark the end of an era. By the time the mafia's influence began to fade from its peak, something unexpected had already taken its place. A legacy. Because even as the real organization became quieter, more cautious, and less dominant, its image only grew stronger, not in courtrooms or police reports, but in culture, in stories, in the way people began to remember and interpret what the mafia had been. And that version was not always accurate. Films, books, and television transformed organized crime into something almost cinematic. Well-dressed men sitting in dimly lit rooms, speaking calmly about power, loyalty, and betrayal. Violence still existed, but it was stylized, controlled, almost elegant. Figures like Al Capone and Lucky Luciano became more than historical individuals. They became symbols, characters in a larger narrative about ambition, control, and the cost of power. And in that transformation, something shifted. The harsh reality, the fear, the coercion, the lives affected by extortion and violence became less visible. Not erased, but softened, reframed. The mafia was no longer just something that existed in the shadows. It became something people watched, analysed, even admired in certain ways, which creates a strange contradiction. An organisation built on secrecy became famous. An underworld built on fear became at times romanticised. But beneath that image, the truth remains more complicated. The rise of the American mafia was not just a story of crime. It was shaped by immigration, exclusion, opportunity, and adaptation. It grew because systems failed, because demand existed, and because individuals recognized how to operate within those gaps.